Why are people placed in immigration detention centres?
It could be for a variety of reasons. Essentially, anybody who's subject to immigration control, so that's anyone who's not a UK citizen, can be detained for various purposes. So they could be detained on arrival in the UK if they don't have the right paperwork, while the Home Office works out whether they've got the right paperwork. They could be detained if they arrive and then make an asylum claim. And they can be detained while that asylum claim is determined. Perhaps if they make an asylum claim, having been in the UK for a while, very often they might be detained while that's dealt with under what's known as the detained fast-track process. If someone is apprehended, perhaps during a workplace raid, so if they're an overstayer, for example, or they've overstayed a student visa, something like that, they haven't observed the terms of their leave to enter the UK, they can be detained while all of that is investigated and pending their removal. And a category of detainees that's been in the news quite a lot recently is former offenders, ex-offenders, so foreign nationals, mostly non-European nationals who've committed an offence here, have been sentenced to more than 12 months and then are subject to what's called automatic deportation. So in practice with those people, many of whom have actually lived here for years and years and might have indefinite leave to remain, they do their time in prison, and then when they're finished, they get moved straight to a removal centre, and from there the Home Office tries to remove them. And in practice it takes quite a long time because they've got families here and homes and all that kind of thing. So they're not necessarily very removable. So you can see it's quite a broad range of people who can be detained.
What effect does being in a detention centre have on the immigrants?
It can be really quite well, it's hugely distressing for people to be picked up and taken into detention. So there's an initial shock, I suppose, when you're detained. You might be picked up in a dawn raid. You have 30 minutes, I think it is, to grab your possessions, or as much as you can. You can take a suitcase worth with you, and then you're taken in a van and you're put into a prison type of situation, basically. So that in itself is very distressing. People are sort of taken away from all their paperwork. They don't know what's happening. They can't communicate. Their nice mobile phone with a camera will be taken off them. And so for a while they just won't be able to contact their family, who may not know who they are. Their kids might have been at school and they've been picked up, that kind of thing. So the arrival time can be very distressing. And then what we find too is that people who are detained for anything more than a couple of months really start to feel the frustration of being detained for what is potentially an indefinite period. The majority of people who are detained, I think it's about 80%, are in and out within a month, and about 10% of detainees are in for over a year. And we're starting to see, it used to be quite uncommon for people to be detained for a year. Now that is unfortunately quite common, and we've got clients on our books who've been detained for 3 or 4 or even 5 years. Almost invariably those are people who've lived here for a long time, but the toll that takes on people's mental state is well documented. It's been documented not just in the UK but in the States and in Australia as well. It's very common for people to develop depression, and where people are already vulnerable and a bit fragile, if they've got some sort of mental disorder, then that is often exacerbated by being in a custodial setting. And for people who have made an asylum claim and that hasn't been accepted, that adds another layer of frustration, because it all feels terribly unfair, that they haven't been listened to. Perhaps their claim has been dealt with very quickly, within a couple of weeks, without the chance to gather sufficient evidence and so on. So there are a lot of reasons why people end up being depressed, and there's a lot of self-harming behaviour. mainly down to the indefinite nature of detention in this country.
What does B.I.D do to help immigrants?
We do three key things. The first thing we do is work with detainees who don't have a legal advisor, and we help them make their own application for release on bail. So we do that through workshops in removal centres where we'll train people to make their own bail applications. We'll support them on our telephone helplines and sort of talk them through the process, help them draw up the grounds for bail and tell them where to send the forms off to and that kind of thing, how to present themselves in court. For very vulnerable detainees or people who've been detained for a long time, we'll actually prepare their bail application and get them a barrister who will be also working for them for free, and that barrister will present their case in court, and obviously that's better than if they were doing it themselves. Coming out of our casework, we do a lot of policy and advocacy work, so we know what's not working in terms of the system for detainees to access bail, to access legal advice, to present their case in court, as well as general conditions in detention. And so we do a lot of policy work with UKBA and increasingly with the Ministry of Justice, Department of Health, to try to get systems changed. We also lobby parliamentarians as well, and we do a lot of research with detainees and with professional researchers to inform all the policy work that we do. So that's sort of trying to change the system, if you like. And when that doesn't work, we engage in strategic litigation, generally against the Home Office. Typically we might intervene in a case which is for unlawful detention, which is being brought on behalf of a detainee or a group of detainees, and where we can assist the court in providing additional information about policies and whether or not UKBA is observing those. We'll submit witness statements to the court and try and bring about change that way as well.
What impact do you think legal aid cuts will have?
I think the impact, it's already being felt, and if the legal aid bill goes through, even with some of the amendments that have been put forward, it could still have very, very serious consequences for immigrants generally, anyone who deals with, who needs immigration legal advice, and particularly for immigration detainees. That will start for people who are foreign nationals who are in prison. The plan is to take all deportation-related matters out of scope of legal aid, so people who've lived here for 30 years and who might have British citizen children here, who've got themselves into trouble, got a deportation order against them, will no longer be able to get legal aid to challenge that. And very often there may be a human rights challenge on, Article 8 grounds, right to a family life, that sort of thing. So you're going to get people who end up in detention at the end of a prison sentence who've been unable to challenge their removal and are on a sort of conveyor belt towards removal. And that's going to see some serious injustice for people who've been living in the UK for a long, long time, who might be taxpayers, been working here for years and so on. Immigration legal advice is perhaps not a very popular thing at the moment anyway in a climate of cuts, and so it's been quite an easy target. And we think that where people have ended up in detention because they've overstayed a visa or otherwise got into trouble with their general immigration status, where they don't have the means to pay for a lawyer themselves, they still need someone to help them sort out their underlying immigration case, because without that, the chances are they can't be removed. So they're going to be detained with no advice, or having had no advice until they're detained, where they can then access limited publicly funded legal advice in detention. But that seems to be a very sort of back to forward way of doing it. We would say it's better to retain immigration legal advice within scope of legal aid before people get into trouble and before people get detained, so that underlying immigration cases can be sorted out. what the Ministry of Justice has committed to is maintaining legal aid in situations where people have lost their liberty, and immigration detention is one of those, mental health detention is another example. So while people are detained, they will always be able to get some sort of limited publicly funded advice subject to a means and a merits test, but that we would say isn't enough usually, particularly for very complex cases. It will tend to run out. So we would say, against all the odds, perhaps, retain immigration legal advice within scope of legal aid, because otherwise you're just going to have a bigger bill at the end of it as people get detained but are not necessarily removable while they're in detention. So it's a very serious area, and all firms at the moment, whatever category of law they operate in, have just had to swallow a 10% cut in legal aid fees. So, working conditions are very difficult for those lawyers that are providing legal aid as well.
What advice would you give to anyone whose loved one is in a detention centre?
The first thing I would say is go and get a lawyer. I would say go and find yourself a good lawyer, and obviously that's quite difficult to determine, particularly if you don't work in that field. If anyone's detained, they can access free legal advice. They can go to the library in their removal centre and sign up for one of the legal advice surgeries. That advice is subject to a means test, so if you've got a lot of money, you're not going to be able to access it, and it is subject to a merits test. But the best thing is to get a qualified immigration lawyer to have a look at your overall immigration case and see what can be done to get you released, because what you want to do is get out of detention and then sort out your immigration case from a position of liberty rather than a position of detention. So that, I think, would be the first thing. And then for people who've, just on a more sort of personal supportive note, I think to keep in contact with that person, act as their information finder, go and visit them, keep in touch with them, and just try and keep their spirits up, because it can be very, very difficult, very disturbing and distressing for people, particularly if they don't really understand what's going on and what's likely to happen to them. So I think legal advice, legal support, try and sort out the underlying problem and help that person to do that is a sort of practical thing that can be done. And on an emotional, supportive level, keep in touch, keep visiting, bringing phone cards and, things to do, and, calling up at night when they're on their own. That kind of thing, I think, is helpful.